what I'd like to do in this little vignette as an introduction to the concert is tell you a little bit about the first part of the concert, which will feature the MKMEA Honor Choir. And you may well ask, what is the MKMEA Honor Choir? First, let me tell you a little bit about MKMEA. It stands for the Midwest Kodály Music Educators of America. So right there in the title of that organization, I've put one thing you're very familiar with, music education, and another thing, Kodály, which you may be less familiar with, in the same phrase. And what does Kodály have to do with music education? He was primarily, first of all, many people would say, a humanitarian. He loved children, and he was concerned for several things where children were concerned. He was concerned that children have a musical education, and an education that would teach them about their Hungarian mother tongue. Some of you may know that at this time and centuries before, we had what was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was true in Hungary, even during Kodály's lifetime, that the uppity-ups, the higher echelons of society, didn't speak Hungarian. They spoke German with each other. And people like Kodály and his comrade in the field of music, Béla Bartók, were concerned that everything Hungarian would end up going by the wayside. It was very important that this music of the people, music of the Hungarian people, their folk songs, and there were different, you know, we might call them tribes, perhaps that's a little too rustic to call them tribes, but peoples from different roots in Hungary, just like we have peoples from many different roots here in the U.S. And each of those groups had their own folk repertoire, which, just as with our own folk repertoires, was not written down. So if it was to be preserved, somebody who had the knowledge and the wherewithal and the equipment had to go out and do something actively to save what would have died with the older people who maybe weren't passing that repertoire on. So Kodály and Bartók went out into the field, as we say, with their very, by today's standards, primitive recording equipment, and they recorded as much Hungarian folk music as they could. They would just find old people and say, sing me every song you know. This is sort of a standard MO for what we call ethnomusicologists today. And thereby, they not only saved their own folk music, they published volumes of Hungarian folk music, but they also encouraged all their neighbors to save their folk music also. And Bartók himself would go to other countries, neighboring countries, to teach them how to do that. They were also an inspiration for people like Ralph Vaughan Williams in England and Cecil Sharp to also catalog and record and notate and publish their folk song repertoires too. But beyond that interest of Kodály's in being able to share the musical, what he called mother tongue, with children, he wanted them to grow up to be what Dr. Romeri was just discussing. He wanted them to be an audience for art music. And it was a great concern that people become literate musicians, just as we want literate readers. You know, we want every single child coming out of school to be able to read. Kodály wanted every single child to be able to read music and to have a growing appreciation for music that might result in two things. Either they just become a very happy listener, they buy tickets to the opera, they buy tickets to the symphony, they make sure that their children have music lessons, or they might also become an amateur or maybe a professional musician themselves. And Kodály and another composer I'll be speaking about in another of these vignettes, Bardos, were very instrumental in raising something that was pretty much dead in Hungary earlier in the 20th century, and that was choral singing. It was in a pretty sad state in Hungary, and these two people, along with a few others, made it one of their life goals to raise the standards of choral singing in Hungary. If you know much about music education, you maybe have heard of the Orff method too. And you may know that Karl Orff, who was a German composer, most famous of course for the Carmina Burana, developed a whole what's called instrumentarium of instruments that children could use that really reflect the different sounds of music from around the world. For example, Orff had metal instruments that are very reminiscent of the Indonesian gamelan. He had barred instruments with wooden bars that were very reminiscent of the sorts of African sounds that you might have, the xylophones, the Latin American handheld percussion instruments, things like viros and maracas and claves were also brought into the method, as well as some actually stringed instruments. Orff actually had the viola da gamba, a very early string instrument, as part of its instrumentarium. A lot of people don't know that. Kodály admired these instruments, but they couldn't afford them in Hungary. That's why the a cappella choral tradition was so important. It was cheap. You know, you didn't have to have an instrument. All you needed was your body. And that's one of the things all of us that are involved with choral music love, is the fact that, you know, we don't need expensive instruments. Sometimes we can, many times an organ, but we can do a lot just with our own voices. And that's one reason why I'm excited that at least one segment of the concert we'll be presenting on October the 6th is a cappella music. But back to MKMEA. This is actually one of the oldest organizations in the world of Kodály teachers, and it happened to have started right here in the Midwest, primarily by people like Sister Lorna Zemke from Silver Lake College and a few other instrumental college professors and other teachers who went to Hungary to see what's going on with music education. Something that Kodály had inspired, that was working, that was turning out fabulous volunteer, amateur, and professional musicians. We brought the ideas back, started to disseminate them with teachers and into the schools, and lo and behold, we finally have not only our own Midwest organization, which is very old, but a large national organization as well, which has subsumed us into the Midwest division. But we still have a very proud heritage. We have had traditionally a conference every fall, and this fall it's going to be here in St. Louis. And in recent years we've had an honor choir, which brings together children with unchanged voices from lots of different places in our 13-state region. And those children have a wonderful opportunity to work with a very talented conductor for a few days and then present a program at the end. So what we're going to do is to combine the program of these children with other aspects of the program, which will be performed by the Webster University choirs, and have just a huge concert that we hope will honor Kodály in a way that would cause him to smile, and hopefully the audience members to smile. And also, I look forward to sharing with you the depths of not only the music of Kodály, but of some of his fellow Hungarians whom you may not have heard of. And I mentioned Bardos earlier, but also Georgi Orban, who is a younger composer and a student of Kodály. Back to the children's choir. It's going to be conducted by Judith Willoughby, who is a very, very well-known conductor of all sorts of choirs all over the world. Judith is now a professor of music, the Wanda Bass professor of music at Oklahoma City University. And Judith and I went to Northwestern together. She was a piano major there. And lo and behold, years later, I was in the at an ACDA convention, and there's Judith. And I'm like, Judith, what are you doing at a choral directors convention? And she's like, well, I'm a choral director now. And I'm like, well, how did this transformation happen? But it's always amazing to see the transformations that happen.